Welcome, everybody. My name is Erin O'Brien, and I am the Policy Programs Director for Wisconsin Wetlands Association, and I'm going to be the facilitator today. It's really nice to see such a big crowd joining us, and we're very excited about the program today. We've had a lot of people working hard on pulling it together, and I think we're going to put on a good show. So welcome again to Hydrology Basics and the Development of Wisconsin's Landscapes. This is a part one of a two-part series that I'm going to describe in a little more detail in a moment. But I want to start with a couple of acknowledgments. So the program we have today is brought to you as a collaboration between Wisconsin Wetlands Association and DATCP. And we are doing this work with funding support from the Environmental Protection Agency. You must have noticed when you logged in that the webinar is being recorded today, and it will be posted on Wisconsin Land and Water's website. And I'd like to also thank Wisconsin Land and Water for all the support they've provided us, both in developing some of the evaluation activities that we'll be doing today. Thank you, Michael Hook, as well as helping promote the webinar. And I know you all are familiar with them, so I need not say more. Okay, so our purpose today, this webinar is part of a pilot training series, the purpose of which is to develop and deliver a core curriculum on hydrologic assessment. And our goals are to help learners evaluate how upstream hydrologic conditions can affect downstream resource concerns, so the things you all are working on every day, as well as finding ways to increase consideration of hydrologic restoration as a soil and water conservation practice. And fortunately, the good news there is that we have some new policies through ADCAP 50 and through a pending general permit that will also help really enable meeting this goal in the future. However, to reach these goals, we really need to start with more core training on some of the hydrologic basics. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do today. So one of the things is that we want to try to build shared understanding of some really fundamental key concepts that maybe are well known to some of you and not known at all to others. And we also want to gather input and data over the course of our hour and a half together to help us refine this curriculum. Again, it's a pilot training series, and so your input will really help us, and we're grateful in advance for you being here as both a learner as well as a participant in helping us make sure that we're meeting everybody's training needs, you and colleagues, moving forward. Keep losing my cursor there. So to that end of seeking input, we'd like to start with a little activity. You don't have to think too hard about this, but please use the chat to share the first thing that comes to your mind for how hydrology relates to soil and water conservation. 1 to 2 sentences maximum, and we're going to take just a couple of minutes to run this exercise. And a round of applause to the first person to enter a post. Yay, Haley! Woo! I'm coming. Okay. Lots of great responses in the chat, and I saw a lot of answers talking about both this is the main driver of erosion and some of my personal favorites. It really affects pretty much everything we do, and we agree, which is why we're here today. So let's keep going. As I mentioned, this webinar today is part of a series of webinars that are planned, and I want to just talk you through, before we get started in today's curriculum, a little bit about how this series is structured. So we're working with something that we like to call the 3 questions approach. If you've been to one of the prior webinars or presentations we've hosted, you've heard myself or Tracy or Kyle Magera talk about this, but here's how it breaks down. First question, how did the hydrology function historically, whether you're talking about at the site level, a stream reach scale, a catchment scale, a whole watershed? How did it function before people came in and started moving things around? What's changed? That's question 2. That might be what's been degraded, or how have we intervened to re-engineer how water's working? And then how can we bring back the health of our hydrology using knowledge from the past to guide us? So as we design and deliver these trainings, we're going to be structuring the offerings in a way that aligns with these questions as follows. So this one, module 1, part 2 are hydrology basics and the development of Wisconsin's landscape. How did it all work before humans came and changed things around? What's changed? We've got 2 different modules. One is an approaches to hydrologic assessment. And I actually just realized I don't have the right title there, but it's a, maybe Kyle Magera could type it in the chat. I have it correct on the slide at the end, but this will be learning about how to think about assessing degraded hydrology and restoration opportunities with a watershed perspective. And then also in this what's changed category, understanding altered hydrologic landscapes. And then finally, module 4, we're going to be doing a bunch of field tours on watershed formed in site assessment and an outcomes-based approach. So what are we going to cover today? Well, in part 1, today's webinar, we're going to be setting the stage for understanding how water moves through our landscapes. And we're going to be sharing our perspectives and inviting yours on how a hydrology-first approach is important to all of our collective work. And finally, and most importantly, we're going to get into the weeds from a technical perspective more on how rivers and wetlands work and work together. The follow-up to this one will be a part 2 webinar in early January, mid-January, exploring the diversity of Wisconsin's watersheds and how they were formed, and learning more about some of the elements that influence water movement and hydrologic processes. One thing I want to offer as a short caveat before we introduce our first speaker is that the concepts that we're presenting today, concepts of hydrology, are universally applicable. And as such, in today's presentations, we're going to be using some Wisconsin examples, but you're also going to see a lot of examples from other parts of the country and even some from around the world. And that's okay, because these are universal concepts. But as we move through this training series, we will be drilling deeper and deeper down, even in part 2 of module 1, and moving forward to make sure that we're bringing it all home to Wisconsin examples as well as applications in your day-to-day work. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Tracy Hames has been the executive director of Wisconsin Wetlands Association since 2011. Prior to that, he spent 25 years as a waterfowl biologist for the Yakama Nation in Washington State. Among other roles, he has served as the lead biologist for the tribe's wetland and riparian restoration project, where he oversaw the restoration and management of 25,000 acres of land. He earned his master's degree from UW-Stevens Point and will call himself a duck guy. Okay, I'm gonna, oh, I forgot, am I supposed to share there was, no, okay. Sending the computer over to Tracy. I have to keep clicking the cursor in there.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for showing up. It's actually afternoon, isn't it? I'm going to run through very quickly some of the very basic concepts that we'll be talking about. Second part of part 1 is a video by Dr. Colin Thorne, who will be talking very specifically in quite a lot of detail about some of the concepts that I'll be introducing right now. And I'll be giving a little bit of a Wisconsin context, mainly talking about basic hydrologic concepts and and some real basic, what does a watershed look like? How does it work? And what are the elements of a watershed? And I can move forward now with this button.
You have to keep clicking for some reason. I'm not sure why it's doing that,
Okay.
but click and then.
All right,
yeah.
great. Okay, so we'll start with what is hydrology. Most of you know this. You've got it, from previous trainings and your schooling in the past. But let's get everybody on the same page. Hydrology, when we talk about it, relates to the movement of water in relation to the land. That includes the movement of surface water, the movement of groundwater, and it also includes the impact of human activity and water movement and on water movement and availability. And that will be covered in the other modules. Today, we'll be mainly talking about healthy situations and the impacts on how surface water and groundwater moves through our watersheds. This photo is actually a very small channel running through a forested area. And I like to show things like this because it's a low energy distributary channel. Upstream of it is a bunch of wetlands. In many situations, we've lost our wetlands, and little channels like this that you can step across have turned into big gullies because there isn't anything to hold that water and it comes rushing down. So, all right, let's review the watershed context. Now, remembering that a watershed is a drainage basin, it's an area of land that channels rainfall, snow melt, and runoff into a common body of water, a lake, a river, a bay, something like that. And the watershed characteristics affect the movement of water and sediment. And the and sediment is a very important part of that. So remember that. And also other materials, things like debris, sometimes trees, brush, things like that. If upstream of your river is an urban area, where I worked historically, sometimes that meant basketballs. And quite commonly, we were finding basketballs coming down the river. So anyways, that type of thing. Whatever's going with the flow of the water is affected by the watershed characteristics. And watersheds come in all sizes and shapes, especially in Wisconsin. We're an incredibly diverse state geographically. Here's a steep watershed in the driftless area, and you can see, all the pieces of that, very narrow floodplains, etc. Next is another type of watershed, looks very different, and that's this is Little Plover River in the Central Sands area in Wisconsin, mostly groundwater fed, very short, very flat. A lot of the snow melts and soaks right into the ground, so a very different situation than the previous watershed that we looked at, and everything in between those two extremes. And remember that the concepts of how water moves through a watershed are the same, even though our watersheds vary in type and size and characteristics. And we'll talk about those things as we move forward. And we'll revisit this watershed later on. Okay, what are the elements of a watershed? Let's break it out. First, we want to talk about the upper watershed zone, which is also known as the source or supply zone in a watershed, where the water comes from. Oftentimes, historically, in healthy situations, there was abundant wetlands, grasslands, and forests. Most of the water flowing through your stream or creek or your watershed originates in the upper watershed zone because of the sheer acreage involved in the upper watershed. So land and or water and rainfall and snowmelt lands in that big area and then moves downward from there. The features in the upper watershed capture rain and snow in a healthy environment. They also capture sediment as sediment is coming off the landscape and slowly release water downstream. And we'll give a couple examples of the things that help capture and slow that water. And also, in many situations, it's the upper watershed that really provides the area where we're recharging the groundwater that ultimately is moving underground towards the river and supplying base flow later in the summer during the hot and dry time of the year. So here's an example in Wisconsin of an upper watershed wetland basin that is very good at capturing snowmelt and rainfall. This is near Somerset in the western part of the state. This is one of the regions in Wisconsin that has true pothole wetlands. Anyways, it looks like a small wetland, but when you have these in abundance across the landscape, they can really work well together to grab a lot of that water and hold on to it and allow it to soak into the ground or transpire into the air, reducing the flashiness of our rain and snow melt events. We also have things called ephemeral wetlands, which a lot of you may know about. And these are the areas that oftentimes people just say it's not a wetland, it's a puddle. They capture rain and snow melt in the spring and they'll pond up. And this is a picture of the same site over different seasons of the year. And so people don't even recognize them as wetlands because they're only wet for a short period of time, often. Incredibly important for reducing, slowing down the flow in our watersheds, reducing the movement of sediment and water and the flashiness of our runoff events. Oftentimes they're in forested areas, but in the agricultural areas, we also oftentimes call them seasonal basins or seasonal wetlands. Oftentimes it'll be the bottom of a cornfield, and that's an area where it's capturing snow melt and rain. Next is the transport zone. So as it comes down from the higher areas, it enters oftentimes single channel zones. Usually they're in steeper areas, confined channels. They may not have much of a floodplain at all or a very narrow floodplain. And they're really good at moving water, sediment, and materials downstream. It's the in-between stuff, the steeper portions of your watershed. And the transport zones can be in any part of the watershed, depending on the layout and the land, the landscape form. There are areas that are flatter and areas that are steeper. And in the steeper areas, you normally have these transport zones. And it's important to learn about these different zones so you can understand the elements of what's going on in your watershed, because we're so different between one part of the state and the next. So a transport zone, here's another one of these very low energy channels like I showed previously. You can step across it, and upstream from it is really good wetlands holding the water. And this is an ephemeral one. This one's probably dry by midsummer. We also have larger areas of our rivers and creeks. This is in the driftless area where you have, as you can see, if you look on either side, there's kind of a very narrow floodplain, and the water is in one channel is moving swiftly. It's mostly gravels and maybe even boulders in a situation like this, moving the water down to the next section. Next section we'll talk about is the floodplain zones. Now, floodplains also can be anywhere in your watershed, depending on the geomorphology, the layout. It's in the flat areas, the broad and flat areas. And it's really important to remember that floodplains are flat. Oftentimes in Wisconsin, we may pull back an eroded bank and say that's a floodplain. It's not. Floodplains are flat. And we oftentimes refer to floodplains as beads on a string, and you'll hear that in the next video that we'll be showing by Dr. Colin Thorne. Really, we're looking at the flat portions of your river or creek, slows the water down, the water spreads out, reducing the erosive energy of the water and cleaning the water. Sediment is deposited on the floodplain, and a lot of good things are happening. Groundwater is being recharged. And also remember that a healthy floodplain is a messy floodplain. What that means is the vegetation and the debris deposited really act as friction and really reduce the energy of the water moving downstream. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here's one of a pretty narrow floodplain zone, and the floodplain is mostly sedge meadow with a single channel running through it. If you walked out to that channel, you'd probably be walking through a couple feet of water. So you can have floodplains with single channels. Here's a really wide floodplain. This is on the La Crosse River. It's flowing from right to left in this photo, and it's breaking up into many different channels in the same zone. Dr. Thorne will be talking in detail about these situations. Big, broad, flat, dynamic. It's hard to tell which is the main channel in a photo like this. Most of these situations in Wisconsin have been lost. We've altered these areas, and so these are rare situations. but very, very valuable and useful. In some situations, we even lose the channel altogether. This is Hay Meadow Creek, northeast of Stevens Point, and the water's flowing from the upper top right of this photo, snaking down to the lower left, and it's hard to see a channel at all. These situations have been almost totally removed in Wisconsin because they've been ditched. And even this Hay Meadow, if you look closely, you can see some ditching in there. And over time, it's finally healing itself. The sedges are growing back, but the water flow here is literally going through thousands of channels interacting with the tussocks and the sedges in the creek itself, and very slowly working downstream. So really neat situation and very beneficial. Downstream, at the bottom, we get the confluence and the estuary zone. And these are also very broad, very flat, but also very dynamic. Oftentimes they're multi-channeled, and it's the transition literally between the stream or creek or river that we're working within and whatever's receiving that water, whether it be a lake or a bigger river or a bay or something like that. And once again, it's processing the water and the sediment and the materials. And many of those can be deposited in the confluence or estuary zone. I'll just show one example here in Wisconsin. And this is the granddaddy of all of them here anyways. This is the Kakagon Bad River Sloughs up in northern Wisconsin flowing into Lake Superior. We have the Bad River, the White River, and the Kakagon Sloughs all entering this very large estuary. It may be the largest on Lake Superior. And multi-channels, and it's dynamic. The channels bounce around over the years and decades, and it's never the same year after year. And you look at this photo and you see the different colors, that's different vegetation types. And really interesting from a habitat standpoint, really healthy from a water management standpoint as well. This is also probably the largest healthy bed of wild rice anywhere in the Great Lakes system in the middle portion of this. Groundwater movement through these estuaries is very strong. I've talked to some folks that have done scuba work, some studies in these channels, and in some areas, just the sheer groundwater movement entering these channels is so strong they can't swim upstream. So interesting, dynamic places. Also have been very altered in much of Wisconsin, these types of watershed elements. So why are we talking about hydrology, and why especially hydrology first? So a lot of times when we're talking about conservation, we say start with the water. Think about the water first. Everything comes from the water. And that's true. The water does drive everything. And remember that all our waters are connected. So what's going on in one part of the watershed can have implications downstream in lower portions of the watershed. In a nutshell, when hydrologic conditions are healthy, the other things we need to do are specific, site-specific interventions. Oftentimes are easier to accomplish and are much more sustainable because we've got healthy situations overall. If we have a watershed where the water movement is not healthy, we can oftentimes be fighting battles in our conservation efforts forever. It's really hard to address some of the problems we're having if overall we've got issues throughout the watershed affecting the movement of water, and they're not sustainable. We talk a lot about Sisyphus, in the Greek mythology, the guy that was condemned to push that rock up the hill, and when he got to the top, it would roll down. He'd have to push it up again for eternity. This little figure here shows kind of what they call the stream mechanics version of how rivers and our watercourses work. And then in the bottom, you can see the base is the hydrology. Then the hydraulics, which is the specific movement of water in specific sites. Then the geomorphology and geology underlying everything, getting up to physical, chemical, and what's going on with that. And then at the top, biology. And Dr. Thorne will be talking in detail about these different pieces of watersheds and how they interact and affect the movement of water. So why is hydrology first important for us? A lot of the work we're doing isn't at a watershed scale. It's literally dealing with specific problems on specific farms or very site-specific scales. So understanding watershed-based hydrology is important because it can inform what you're doing, whether you're working throughout a whole watershed or whether you're working on pieces of it inside the watershed to address problems that we're having. And when we address the hydrologic conditions first, what we're doing is looking at the root causes of the issues that we may be having on a farm or in a short portion of our watershed. So understanding what's going on in the watershed will help inform you of the work that might need to be accomplished in site-specific locations, even if you're not able to work throughout the whole watershed. So it helps you understand the context within what you're working and be most effective on coming up with solutions to the issues that you're dealing with by looking at what are the root causes of the problems we're having. If we don't address the root causes, our actions could have temporary results that require repeated repair and maintenance. And we've all been there, right? Where we've done something, we did our best, it worked really well. 5 years later, it was in a shambles. So understanding what's going on and what's causing those issues helps you be more successful. So understanding hydrology, watershed-based work will help you implement your county soil and water management plan. And I'll give one quick example, and that's in the Little Plover River. And you'll learn more about this watershed and the approach that's being taken here in a future module. In a nutshell, a lot of us know about the Little Plover River. It's in the Central Sands region in an area of very heavy irrigated agriculture and a lot of straws in the ground, high cap wells sucking groundwater out of the ground. Little Plover River is 90% groundwater fed, so that groundwater is critical to the health of that watershed. A lot of folks for many years have been looking at the issues and some of the problems that are going on in Little Plover River. Some of it's drying up, some of it was just way shallow and really sandy bottom and didn't look very healthy. And a lot of interventions have been going on for many years. And a lot of those didn't last very long because they really didn't take the hydrology first approach that we're promoting in these modules. In this area in the middle where it says trout habitat, a lot of stuff's gone on over the years. And one of the later, concepts was, well, if we can just reduce the pumping in this area, then we'll be able to fix the river. It'll be okay. And that's true to a very large extent. But what we found taking this 3 questions approach with an interdisciplinary team, we found a lot more to the story than just the well impacts. So as we looked at what the conditions were, pre-development, how the watershed was formed, we were able to learn a lot more about the root causes of the issues that were being identified in this river, and we're able to address them now much more cost effectively and in a much more sustainable way. And we'll learn more about how we did this later. So I won't give too much information at this point. But the main message is it was going through the process, looking at the historical conditions, what we've changed that really helped us understand what other actions needed to happen besides water removal, conservation in the agricultural landscape to make this river healthy. And now they're being implemented with really, really exciting results. So with that, we will move on to the next portion of our presentation today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tracy. I want to just note we are going to have some time for questions and answers towards the end of the webinar, but we're going to keep moving through our prepared content with a bunch of interaction in the next section. So thanks for bearing with us. Okay, so next up, as Tracy has mentioned several times, we have a section on how rivers and wetlands work and work together. But before we do that, it's time for a pop quiz. Okay. Nope. Hang on, Emily. So humor us here. We are not going to test you on the things that Tracy just shared. We want to ask a couple of questions that relate to the content that's just about to be delivered. And the reason we're doing this is it gives us a good base understanding of what percentage of our very large audience is familiar with the concepts that we're covering and at what level of detail. So go ahead and launch the poll, Emily. There's just 2 questions. Some of you, these will be very obvious, and some of you may not have heard even of all the terminology. So go ahead and take your time, and we'll continue with our program in about a minute. Emily just reminded me that for the recording, it might be beneficial to read the questions. So the first one is, which of the following strongly influence hydrology? Choose all that apply: geology, geomorphology, biology, or none of the above. The second question is, the region of sediment and porous space beneath and alongside a stream bed where there is mixing and storage of shallow groundwater and surface water is called the, you have 4 choices: the subsurface transport zone, the saturated stream reach, the hyporheic zone, or the invertebrate buffet. Okay. We'll give it another couple of seconds and then we'll share your results. Okay. Let's go ahead and let you see. So, can you all see these results? Question 1, which of the following strongly influence hydrology? The answer is all: geology, geomorphology, and biology. Looks like some of you answered all 3. Some of you answered just 1. Okay, and then here we go. The correct answer on question number 2 is the hyporheic zone. And it looks like maybe this is a term that not all of you are familiar with. And so we're going to introduce it starting very shortly. So hold on one moment, Emily. I'd like to just introduce our next speaker. As Tracy mentioned, today, our main event is to share a recorded presentation that we've been using for training purposes since it was first delivered at WWA's Wetland Science Conference in 2021. Recall that was the pandemic, so we were virtual. It's 30 minutes long, but we're going to stop several times for interactive exercises and to deliver clarifying content. Just to acknowledge, we know that video streaming on Zoom can be a little less crisp than we'd prefer, but we have done this several times, and I think we're all sort of used to that quality challenge. So thanks very much for tolerating it. So let me quickly introduce our speaker before we launch the video. Our presenter, Dr. Colin Thorne, is a very accomplished man. He is the chair of physical geography at the University of Nottingham. That's in England, a fluvial geomorphologist with an educational background in environmental sciences, civil engineering, and physical geography. He has published 9 books and over 120 journal papers and book chapters, and he's worked all over the world, including posts with USDA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA Fisheries, and Colorado State University. He's also a good friend of ours and our organization, and we're pleased to share some of his knowledge with you today. So I'm going to stop share and invite Emily to launch the video.
And here we go. So my talk today is about how rivers and wetlands work and how they work better together. And I'll also talk about why we don't see rivers and wetlands working together as much as we used to, and why I think it's a good idea for us to restore river-wetland connectivity in order to build productivity and resilience in our river systems, which they're going to need badly in what is a very uncertain future. But to start with the basics, the primary function of a river is to be part of the water cycle. Rainfall falls out of the sky, it flows over the ground surface, concentrates in the river valleys, and then flows back to the water body from whence it came. Simple. But of course, there's a bit more to it than that, because a lot of the water that falls out of the sky doesn't form overland flow. It infiltrates into the soils and rocks and makes its way to the river by a much slower route through the groundwater. But even this groundwater thing is also a bit complicated, because there's really two elements to it. There's the regional groundwater in the what we call the aquifer, the porous rocks, but also there's an underground component to the river that flows through the river sediments in parallel to the river that we can see on the surface. And it's this coupling between the river above and below ground that is a particular characteristic of rivers flowing through floodplains. So while the primary function of a river is to return water from the uplands to the lowlands to complete the water cycle, another very important function is sediment transport. Because up in the headwaters, if you like, the supply zone, sediment enters the river from active weathering, that's the breaking down of rocks by chemical and physical and biological processes, steep slopes down which the sediment that's produced by weathering tumbles, multiple tributaries that collect that sediment and deliver it down into the mainstream. And then the tributaries and the mainstream transfer the sediment along the main river, moving it to the deposition zone. Although some of the sediment is stored along the way in building the river floodplain. Eventually then the sediment is deposited in a delta or in a lake or at the coastline, and that fulfills the second role of the river, which is in terms of sediment transport. And this is really important. To quote Luna Leopold, one of the great river scientists of all time, rivers are the gutters down which flow the ruins of continents. So how are these gutters, if you like, or channels formed? Well, they're formed by the fact that we have a sloping valley floor, which gives the river potential energy, and we have a flow of water, as I've just said, and we have a supply of sediment. And these three elements together form the river channel, or the gutter down which flows the ruins of continents. However, the size and shape and characteristics of that river channel may be constrained by the width that it's got to work in, because the valley may confine the river and somewhat limit the interactions between the water and the sediment and the valley slope. This is shown very nicely in a diagram by Friars, Wheaton and Brierley, who show how we go from laterally confined river valleys up in the headwaters where the bedrock hill slopes are close together, to being partly confined in the middle course in the transfer zone, where the bedrock control is still there, but it isn't as tight, but where we may have other constraints, such as alluvial fans built by tributaries that bring a lot of sediment in, or remnants of the floodplain left by ancient historical rivers, which are less erodible and often higher, and which can also partly confine the modern day river. So it's only really in the laterally unconfined reaches, the depositional reaches, that we see the river able to express itself completely in terms of forming a channel and a floodplain entirely of its own making. In this context, Friars, Wheaton and Brierley said that the downstream sequence of valley settings, confined, partly confined, unconfined, is a key control on long-stream patterns of water flow and sediment transport, the two most important functions of the river. This diagram by Mark Beardsley shows this quite nicely, in as much as what we see is that the river valley width, the flow width, varies along the course of the river, sometimes being wide, sometimes being narrow. In the narrow spots, we don't have a lot of canvas to work on in terms of creating a complex channel. But if we take those away, we can see in the wider spots, that's where the river is able to deposit sediment, build its floodplain, and build a complex channel. And Mark described these wider parts as being like the beads on a string, so interspersed along the river's path. So we can look again at this sediment supply transfer deposition diagram and see that it's actually possible for there to be multiple transfer and depositional strings and beads on the river course along its length. And generally what I'm talking about today in terms of river floodplains and wetland complexes, those are going to be associated with the unconfined depositional reaches much more than with the narrower transfer reaches. Coming back then to Fryer, Wheaton and Briley's diagram, they go on to say also that valley confinement is a primary control on river planform and processes that occur on and along valley bottoms. Looking in a bit more detail at one of these beads, one of these wider unconfined areas here on this river in Vermont, you can see that the river's adopted a sinuous meandering pattern. And looking at the diagram below, which is a terrain model, we can see not only the current channel in bright white, but also remnants and abandoned channels and oxbows left behind by the river as it is swept back and forth across the full width of the valley floor. This makes rivers much more dynamic when they're able to do this, when they're able to move around and create and recreate floodplain areas, to the point that the river's constantly changing. And so the statement by Heraclitus, the famous Greek philosopher, that no person ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river, is absolutely true in these areas where the river is constantly changing. Now, the type of river channel that we get then can be explained by the degree of confinement or unconfinement, and whether we're in a source or a transfer or a deposition reach. And this diagram by Stanley Shum, another one of the great all-time river scientists, shows how rivers can be straight or meandering or braided, depending on how much confinement we've got, and how they can even be anastomosing if we have an unconfined, fully depositional reach. And anastomosing is a medical term for the fingers, the veins on the back of your hand and the way that they are fingered rather than bundled. So it's possible to explain the river channel type that we have purely in terms of the water flow, the sediment flow, and the degree of confinement. That's to say, the physics and the hydrology and the geology of it.
Okay, we're going to pause there for just a moment because he's about to introduce a new, I'm not, yeah, I hope everyone can hear me. We're going to pause there because he's just about to open a new concept, but we want to do a little activity. We have a survey that Emily's going to launch in a moment. And let me just say this. It is a knowledge check on some of the concepts that Colin has just presented and Tracy introduced. And in some ways that's kind of silly. You know, we're not in 8th grade and you don't need to, you know, we don't need to teach to the test. However, we wanted to put it in here just to make sure that the concepts that we've been presenting are presented clearly enough for learners to retain it and to just get a feel for whether we do need some kind of a knowledge check exercise on these concepts at this point or some future point in the webinar for future delivery. So with that, thank you for taking this poll, and Emily, go ahead and launch the activity. Okay, looks like we've got most of our participants answering, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results and let you know that in fact the unconfined reach is the correct answer. There is the depositional zone, also known as the floodplains. The confined reach, item 2, is the transfer zone, and item 3 is headwaters or the supply zone. Okay, we're going to continue on with the video.
But that rather misses something that also is pretty clear in this diagram, which is that it gets a lot greener from the bottom from the top right-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner, as the floodplain and the islands become increasingly thickly vegetated. And what we're seeing there is the influence of biology, which is missing from a purely physics-based explanation. To try and capture the importance of biology, Janine Castro and I drew the stream evolution triangle, a ternary diagram showing the influences of hydrology and geology and also biology. Down at the base of the triangle, we see channel forms dominated by hydrology or by geology or by their interaction. But as we move up and the influence of biology increases, we see meandering channels, island braided channels, and then at the top of the triangle, anastomose rivers, where the biology is perhaps the strongest driver on channel form. And we can think of this sort of trend from physics to biology as the biological uplift that occurs as the biology has more and more influence, as increasingly we move from a pure river to something that's more akin to a wetland. We shouldn't really be surprised that the influence of biology can be so great, because if we just think in terms of energy, which is the capacity to do work on the landscape, if we look at the energy in the biological system, it dwarfs the energy in the geological system. This is shown in a diagram by Jonathan Phillips from University of Kentucky. And just bear in mind the Y scale here is a logarithmic scale. Each cycle there is a factor of 10. So in terms of the energy contest, it really is no contest. Biology dwarfs geology. Turning to how wetlands work. Well, in this diagram, we see what a wide range of possible wetland settings there are in the watershed. And the primary function of wetlands contrasts with that in rivers, in as much as rather than conveying water, they store water during the hydrological or water cycle. If we go around the clock here, starting with the headwater areas, those are the depressions or the bowls above the river systems where the water first collects. We see that very often those are characterized by wet meadows or wet woodlands. Where we have steep slopes, the land surface intersects the groundwater, and we have springs, and we have slope-based wetlands. We can have benches or lowlands where depressions collect water and intersect the groundwater flow, and those are called palestrine or vernal pool wetlands. And along the coast, there's a whole plethora of wetland types, from marshes and swamps to mudflats and estuaries. But it's along the river valleys that we have maybe the richest wetlands. We can have channeled valley floor river wetland corridors. We can have unchanneled valley floor river wetland corridors where there really isn't a channel, and the watercourse switches between being a river during wet periods and a sort of linear wetland during dry periods. And of course, we can have those unconfined valley bottoms where we see a real river, floodplain river wetland corridor. Whatever type of wetland we have, though, there are three distinctive features. First, that the land is covered by water at some time during the growing season every year. Second, that the soil is undrained. That's to say it's mostly saturated, it's dark and black and doesn't have much oxygen in it for the vast majority of the time. And thirdly, that the plants are mostly water loving or at least water tolerant. Otherwise, they wouldn't survive with the undrained soils and with being inundated for part of the season. All wetlands have at least one of these attributes, and many of them have two or three. And that's what makes wetlands what they are, because they work as sort of the kidneys in the water cycle. You see, they hold the flow, and they have these anoxic, saturated conditions within which bacteria are able to break down contaminants and cleanse the flow, and they're able to cycle nutrients and produce high primary productivity. They provide critical wildlife habitat, they clean the water, they slow the water, and they release it gently back into the stream. They also often cool the water because the cold groundwater is able to lower temperatures during hot periods. So essentially, these areas play a critical role in cycling and decontamination of water, in water storage, in providing habitat for waterfowl, mammals, fish, and many other organisms. In fact, wetlands are probably the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. So you can see then that rivers and wetlands work in rather different ways. But when you put them together, there are synergies between them that make them both work and function more effectively. In this diagram from a forthcoming paper first authored by Ellen Wohl at Colorado State University, we see the spectrum of river-wetland interactions going from rather dry systems on the left, where the water table is relatively low, and the duration of connectivity between the river and the wetlands and the floodplain and the groundwater is relatively short duration each year, all the way over to the right-hand type of river, where the water table is at the ground surface or above it all the time, where the duration of hydrological connectivity, wetland of water connectivity is permanent. And what we find is that the richness and diversity that's associated with wetlands becomes imprinted on the river more and more the wetter it gets. Now, these sorts of situations where we have that close coupling of rivers and wetlands are favored.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. I just want to interject something here. Emily's going to try to back the slide up a little bit. So thanks, Emily. So in this slide, of course, you're seeing a lot of mountainous examples. You're seeing a couple mountain examples. You're seeing some international examples, but we do find this same gradient of river-wetland interactions across the diversity of stream and wetland types in Wisconsin. And as Colin points out, that the groundwater influence is a major driver of hydrologic connectivity, and that's true here as well. What you don't really see on this slide is anything that resembles a wetland scrape. And so we just wanted to comment on that. Wetland scrapes are a technique most traditionally used for wildlife enhancement purposes, and specifically to add open water habitat to improve waterfowl production. And they can be very effective for this purpose, and they can somewhat mimic the characteristics of a shallow marsh. But if the goal of that you're working towards is improved hydrologic connectivity and healthier aquatic systems, we do need to be thinking beyond scrapes. And as I mentioned earlier, fortunately, we now have more latitude within DATCP 50 and pending general permits to enable this. We're not going to talk about policy or practices today, but it will be a big part of our discussions at the field tours that will be held as part of this training series later this next spring and summer, so up in 2025. Okay, we can continue.
We find is that the richness and diversity that's associated with wetlands becomes imprinted on the river more and more the wetter it gets. Now, these sorts of situations where we have that close coupling of rivers and wetlands are favored by particular combinations of geology, biology, and geomorphology. We need the right geologic structures to create the space and the connectivity for a river wetland system. We need the biotic drivers to boost that connectivity, and things like beaver dams and log jams and very dense stands of vegetation do that. We need complex ecosystems with multiple layers in the food web. That means having apex predators like this grizzly bear. And we need geomorphic processes. We've already talked about how tributary fans can partially confine a river valley and create the ponding conditions upstream that favor a river wetland corridor. But so can mass movements, landslides. So can aggradation in depositional zones. So can moraines laid down, drift if you like, laid down by glaciers. So can stepped river valleys with those beads on the string that you get in many glaciated areas. So there are particular combinations of geology, of biology, and of geomorphology that promote the formation of these river wetland corridors. And they're pretty common. So you might expect to see them, all over the place, but we don't. And there is a reason for that, and it's us. They've become rare because we've eradicated very, very large numbers of river wetland corridors. For example, here's the River Rhine in the early 19th century, and it's clearly anastomosed and complex and connected. By the end of that century, though, thanks to the work of Johann Gottfried Tuller, the self-proclaimed tamer of the Rhine, a lot of that complexity has gone. And that was done in order to improve navigation and to improve flood control. And by the 20th century, we have the fully canalized single-thread meandering channel that we see today. That's a simplified version of what nature produced, and it's the outcome of human interventions. But if you go to areas that, for one reason or another,
Okay. Before we move on, we're going to do a little exercise together related to those three types of channel forming conditions. So Emily's going to go ahead and launch a whiteboard for us, and I'll take a minute to explain what we're looking at once it's on our screens. By the way, I can take this opportunity to shout out Emily Buck, our communications manager, who is our technical support today, and she's been incredibly helpful. Okay. So it's taking a moment, but what we'd like to do is just see the extent to which we can apply the concepts that Colin just presented in terms of the multi-channel systems, the partially trained but still somewhat multi-channeled rivers, and those that are fully channelized down to a single thread or a ditch. So this is a whiteboard exercise, and I'm going to give you the instructions, and then we'll take about 5 minutes for you to do the work. The first thing I'll mention is if it looks very tiny on your screen, you can zoom. You can control this by zooming your own screen. So what we'd like you to do is the directions are on the left. Click your cursor on the T tool to select. It's on the left to select the text tool, and then click in the box of your choice to the right. And what we're looking to do is to see if we can identify examples here in Wisconsin of some of these three different types of situations. Once you start typing, if your text looks really tiny, which it probably will, you can click in the box and you'll have control to increase the font a little bit. So we're going to just let you roll here and see, and specifically we're hoping that you might come up with some examples of one or more of these scenarios in the areas where you live and work. Yeah, and oh, thank you, sorry. What we'd like you to add is the name of the river or stream and the county that the area you're thinking about is located in. I can do some making it bigger. it's great to see all these examples being added. If for any reason anyone's having technical difficulty and they want to contribute to the exercise but can't figure out how to deal with the whiteboard, you are also welcome to put your thoughts into the chat. But please do identify which of the boxes you intend the entry to be attached to.
We're really paying attention.
We're really enjoying watching these examples come in. We're familiar with a lot of the areas that are being posted, and there's lots of head nods on our end here of, yeah, these are really great examples, and looks like everyone was really paying attention. Also, not a surprise to see a lot more, not as many as I expected though, entries in the channelized box. I think maybe we'll go another 15, 20 seconds or so, give everyone a chance to put in their last entries. It's okay if the charts are a little messy because we'll get a chance to save these and we can clean these up and look at them in more detail after the webinar. Okay, I see a couple people more typing, so take maybe five, 6 more seconds and we're gonna wrap it up. Thank you so much for participating in this exercise. This is really interesting. Okay, so we just have a little more of Colin's video.
That have not been developed in that way, you can see that remnants of river wetland corridors still exist. Top left, we see the Pantanal of Brazil and Paraguay and Bolivia, perhaps the world's greatest river wetland corridor, where we have this fantastic mosaic of green and blue interlaced together. Top right, we see a drier landscape where groundwater is really important in feeding the river wetland corridor, and that's the Okavango in Africa. Bottom left, we see the Gara in Ireland, just a tiny remnant of what was once a huge river wetland corridor. And in the bottom right, we see St. Vrain Creek in Rocky Mountains of Colorado, where again, groundwater supports a wetland system in what is a snowmelt stream that has very, very long dry periods, but stays green and verdant because of groundwater. And these river wetland corridors cut right across rivers of all scale. You've already seen some in the diagrams there for the Amazon, biggest river in the world. But here's the Methow River showing the complexity on the left of a medium-sized river, and Summit Creek on the right, a order of magnitude smaller again, and yet still we can see that patchy mosaic. We can still see that sort of kaleidoscope of colors indicating channels and wetlands and floodplains and islands, all hydrologically connected. So they still exist if you know where to look for them. And within Wisconsin, they're still here too. In 2019, I was fortunate enough to go on a whirlwind trip across the state looking at streams with Ray White. And one of the stops Ray arranged for me was here in Menominee County, which is contiguous with the Menominee Reservation. And when we look at the reservation in this Google Earth image with a leaf-off view, you can see how the signature of the landscape is a little bit different in the reservation to outside. But if we look at a leaf-on view for 2016 here, you don't really need the outline to show you where the reservation is anymore. You can pick it out from the vegetation cover because the canopy is so continuous. But there is that sort of slash across the top left-hand corner of lighter green that's a tornado track. And I'll just show you what that looks like in a moment. On the ground, what we find is really, really beautiful river wetland corridors with great cover, with very variable water depths and velocities, with downed trees providing cover, with undercut banks, with vegetation all over the place providing shade, very good groundwater interconnection, keeping the water cool during hot periods, sediments grading from sands to boulders, velocities varying, depths varying, just a huge diversity of morphology, which supports a huge biodiversity, including, of course, trout. And even in the area that was hit by the tornado and really torn up, we see nature bouncing back. The alders are recuperating rapidly. In due course, there'll be succession. We'll get willows, we'll get cottonwoods, we'll get a whole range of forest trees. And the wetlands are still there, and the diversity is still there, and the recovery is being driven by nature, not by humankind. Across the state in the driftless area, down in Vernon County here, I was fortunate enough to go to Coon Valley and the Bohemia Valley, or Coon Creek in the Bohemia Valley. Now, this tributary to Coon Creek, Rundle Coulee, was really, really heavily hit by floods in 2018, just the year before I was visiting. You can see the single thread meandering channel that was there in this pasture has been replaced by some kind of braided slash anastomosed system that's quite different. And even in the wooded areas, there's a lot of disruption because the channel here has gone multi-threaded and a wide variety of depths and velocities and everything else in this disturbed system. And usually what would happen after this kind of disturbance is repair work. And Kirk Olson lent me these slides showing reaches of Timber Coulee, where on the left, riprap has been used to repair an eroding bank to protect farm buildings. And on the right, riprap wasn't needed, but bank reshaping and regrading has been done again to stabilize the channel. And in both cases, in the September 2020 images, you can see that, in fact, stability is being recovered quite quickly. However, in another reach of Timber Coulee, no work has been done, and yet that reach is recovering too, but it's recovering naturally. And as it's doing so, the wetlands and the oxbows and the connectivity are reasserting themselves. And in terms of fish numbers, both young of year and mature fish, the numbers in this reach are just as good as those in the artificially repaired reaches. So perhaps it's possible then for us to allow.
Hey, all, we're just going to take a quick moment. Tracy has been out to this site and he wanted to give a little context because it's a rather complex set of images.
Yeah, it's hard to really tell what's going on just looking at these photos. So we just wanted to show that, after the 2018 big storm event, and it really, blew out a lot of the areas and there was nothing left but a lot of gravel and cobble behind the big storm event. What he's trying to show here is that with the influence of the biology over time, and in this situation, a couple of years, what became a real unstable braided situation when the vegetation started to reclaim the area, channel form returned, and healthy conditions really started to come back, and a lot of it was due to the influence of the vegetation than moving in on this landscape. Oftentimes, when we look at things like this, we want to start getting those big yellow machines out there and doing, putting the river back where it's supposed to be, or this or that. And in this condition, what Colin's point is that vegetation did a lot of the work for us if we would just give it a little bit of time. And that's one of the points he's making here. So part of the wisdom of understanding hydrologic conditions at a watershed scale is to knowing when to intervene and when maybe we don't have to intervene so strongly.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. One thing I also just want to mention is that we are working off of 2 computers today. And so I know there are sometimes little delays between when Emily pauses and the video stops or catches up. So thanks for your patience as we reset our mark here.
Nature to recuperate and recover without the need to burn diesel or get involved in reshaping and armoring banks. But we can't always wait for nature because, frankly, it's just going to take too long and we haven't got time because of climate change and pressures on streams. And in the state of Oregon, the U.S. Forest Service's River Restoration Advisory Team has been taking a fairly radical approach called Stage Zero. Here in this wetland meadow that we've got an incised gully, there shouldn't really be a channel here at all. And so what Paul Powers and the team have done is filled it in. And the red circle is there as a marker on that stump. And within a very, very short period, again, we've got that natural recuperation and bounce back. We've got the recovery of the system because we've rehydrated it. And it isn't only small upland meadows that we can do this in. Here's the South Fork Mackenzie River, a fairly big stream, but due to past incision and channelization in the lower course here, there was just 11 acres of wetted area at low flow, and in phase 2 of the lower course, there was just 10. Post-project, those numbers are increased by a factor of 3.5 in phase 1 and nearly double in phase 2 through filling in the channel and reconnecting the remnant channels and the abandoned channels that were still there in the floodplain, but were just disconnected due to channel degradation. And I'll just show you what that means on the ground with a couple of video clips. Video 1 upstream in a reach that wasn't restored or hasn't been restored yet, and reach 2, video 2 here at the junction between the 2 restoration phases. This is the upstream reach at a flow of about 3,000 cubic feet per second, about 10 times base flow. And it's basically a fire hose. High velocities, high turbulence, very, very hostile environment, and juvenile fish can't stay in this reach. They're just flushed downstream. If we contrast that with the same discharge on the same day in the restored reach, where the flow is spread out across the valley bottom, where it's distributed between channels and wetlands and floodplains, where the energy is dissipated by a lot of large wood and standing forest, then you can see there are flood refugia everywhere and a depositional environment and a completely tamed flood. That's the difference then between the fire hose and the restored floodplain system. So that's why these systems are so productive, because they attenuate floods, they support biodiversity, they denitrify polluted soils, they store sediment, they create habitats, they have good subsurface water storage and linkages, the food supply is ample, particular organic matter is stored to build soils, and those soils store organic carbon. In short, what this means is that these river floodplain corridors have a home for everybody and everything, really from bugs to bears. The whole ecosystem, diverse ecosystem, can coexist in harmony. So how do we attain this kind of balance of nature? How do we put nature to work with us to build resilient and self-recuperating systems? Well, I think we do so by recognizing, that the geosphere and the biosphere are not two separate planets as they're depicted here, with some kind of Venn diagram overlap. They intersect completely. There's just the one planet. And in terms then of river restoration and wetland restoration, we need to join those up too. We need to think about river wetland corridors and how they can be recreated and rediscovered. And I think you'll hear about that from Joe Wheaton later in the conference. And where we're heading with this is a different vision of what the river could be, as captured in this beautiful diagram supplied to me by Dorothy Merritt. And I think you'll see this one again too. What rivers could be above and below ground, what rivers could be in terms of river wetland corridors. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you all for sitting through that. And I've watched it probably 6 to 8 times, and I learned something new every time. So we have about 12 minutes left, and I've got a couple more slides, and then we're gonna move over to our Q&A. So let me come back to our presentation and okay, and move forward. So we want to just go through a few of our key concepts review, right? So we've heard a lot about healthy river wetland corridors often have multiple channels. And of course, in some situations also that complexity becomes so complex that we lose the channel, we lose the visual channel altogether, and things spread out into more of a flowing wetland situation. River wetland corridors include 3 zones: supply zone, transport zones, and depositional zones, which of course are our floodplains. To find the floodplain restoration opportunities in your community, you want to look for the flat, unconfined beads on the string. And you're going to hear a lot more about this in one of the future events that we're hosting as part of this training series. And of course, vegetation, or the biology, and groundwater are very important, but sometimes overlooked, often overlooked drivers of hydrology. So briefly want to mention what's happening next. So the part 2 of this first module is focused on the development of Wisconsin's landscapes. We have a date, January 16th from 1 to 3 p.m. It will be another webinar. Our speakers will be live. And so you'll have them for live Q&A, and the registration for that will be posted within about the next week. But please go ahead and mark your calendars if you're interested. Also, a module 2 with the correct title here. I had that slide botched earlier. At Wisconsin Land & Water Conference, a technical roundtable using a watershed perspective to assess hydrologic restoration opportunities. That's that continuation of the where do we find the beads on the string and other opportunities that will be facilitated by Kyle McGarrett and Bart Chapman, or at least they're planning it on our behalf. So before we move to Q&A, which we'll do almost momentarily, we have one more exercise for you. These are just some post-content reflections that will help us evaluate and refine this in future curriculums. And we're going to be doing this in 2 ways. Right now, we have one more short whiteboard exercise. And then when you close out today, a survey is going to pop up that is asking for just a little more information. If you would like to provide input but don't have time today, we will also be emailing that survey out sometime tomorrow morning. So go ahead, Emily, and launch the whiteboard, and then we will move on to Q&A. I want to just check and make sure that people are seeing the whiteboard on their screen because I don't see it on mine. It looks like there is activity happening there, so it's just a glitch on my end. So I'll watch Emily's screen. If anyone is having trouble, please make a note in the chat. It does seem like a few people can't see the whiteboard, and so I'm just going to read the questions, and you're welcome to enter your answers into the chat. The first is, what did you learn today that was new for you? The second is, what do you need more information about? And maybe one of our staff could type these into the chat if they have a moment. And then the third, what content from today's event do you think is most important to share with others you work with? And who else, which audiences need to know today's info? I think we're going to switch from the whiteboard exercise to questions because we only have about 5 minutes left. I will say, at least on our end, we can stay over if people want to stay on for a little bit. And then Tracy Hames and Bart Chapman have offered to support this Q&A. Bart, if you're able to stay a few extra minutes, that would be great. If you need to go, we'll capture additional questions in the chat and find a way to get back to people. Okay, so I'm going to my video and invite Tracy and Bart to turn their videos on as well. Okay.
Hello, how are we handling? Are we
okay.
doing questions in the
Yes,
chat?
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm supposed to be sharing screen too here. So let's do that. Emily, can you unshare your screen, please? If you have questions, please type them in the chat and we will pop them over to Bart and Tracy.
All right. Is the angle good?
You look great. Nice
Thanks.
to see you. Okay, are you done? Okay, I'm going to just, yeah, so if you have questions, please type them in the chat. And if you don't have questions, I'll put Bart on the spot and ask him to reflect on the content and the activities today and their relevance to some of the things that DATCP is trying to support for all the counties.
Certainly. Recent discussions with Kyle in preparation for the roundtable technical discussions and trying to expand on what our conservation engineering staff has completed thus far in this effort. We tried to come up with a desktop analysis to get a better handle on watersheds. We did some site visits. This coming year, we're really trying to identify projects on the Wisconsin landscape that might be good candidates for meeting the intent of hydrologic restoration. So the exercise, the whiteboard exercise today, and seeing those different rivers and streams throughout the state in their different conditions is kind of eye-opening, like you had mentioned, Aaron.
Great. Thank you. I'm surprised that I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I'm going to invite people to not be shy, and also to invite Tracy and Bart to share any other reflections they'd like to share to fill in any cracks that they think maybe weren't well addressed or that maybe popped up in the chat along the way.
Tracy, I always liked listening to your conversations regarding waterfowl and production areas and the history of wildlife biologists and kind of the traditional uses of wetland restoration to meet that objective and how that compares and contrasts to the objectives of hydrologic restoration.
Yeah, one of the great things I learned over my career managing lots of land as a waterfowl biologist, when I got out of Stevens Point, we were trained back in the 1980s that as a duck biologist, it was our job to make conditions best for a duck. And then I just happened to get a job working for a tribe out west that mostly cared about salmon and didn't care about ducks. But what I ended up learning is that when we're bringing back conditions as close as possible to historic conditions and restoring the hydrologic health to a watershed, the benefits of the diversity and to all the different things actually are the most sustainable and most effective, even for waterfowl. And so it's a little humbling because oftentimes we think we know everything about what this species or that species needs, and we want to engineer those things and make those things. And sometimes letting nature restore itself, helping it in these incredibly disturbed situations is oftentimes the best response. And what I found in these salmon waterways, by bringing back those conditions close to historic in an incredibly altered landscape in the irrigated arid West, provided the best waterfowl conditions in the area as well. I had really good duck production and wintering and migratory. So that's the kind of perspective we're trying to show. Get away from the single species and get more into the systems approach and looking at how the water functioned historically and how can we try and bring it back to that self-sustaining condition.
Thanks, Tracy. If folks want to stay on for a couple extra minutes, we do have a couple of questions in the chat. And the first one is DNR on board? And will they approve permits for restorations along streams? Tracy, you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, some exciting things are happening right now, I think. Now there's a new general permit being formed that Tom Nedlin is really helping develop, and it's not live yet, but we hope this spring. And that's all about coming up with ways to help improve our ability, permitting-wise, to implement hydrologic restoration in these areas. And there's some pilot projects being promoted, one in Plum Creek, down in Crawford County, and a few others to really help move forward the permitting aspects of some of these types of interventions that are working more towards getting hydrologic conditions back. And DNR, from our perspective, seems really excited about working with the permits and coming up with ways that will help facilitate people to do these types of interventions. And we're going to be learning as we go over the next several years. And it's an exciting time. And So stay tuned. And if you're interested in doing this type of work, or if you have projects, I would ask you to really look into the hydrologic restoration general permit. And this training course over these modules is tied in with the types of information and things you need to gather to complete a hydrologic restoration permit.
Thanks so much. Maybe we'll take one more question. There's, and this one's for you, Bart. Maybe you can reflect on what the agency's been doing to support HEC-RAS. So the question was, do these projects need floodplain modeling, HEC-RAS? And if it's needed, who can do that? And is there funding for that if it has to be done by a private engineer? How about you take part one and I take part two?
Yes, there will be projects that are located in Zone AEs. These are mapped floodplains under the federal insurance program through FEMA. Any work, excavations, any building, any work in those regulatory floodplains will require a HEC-RAS or similar model. HEC-RAS seems to be the industry standard, has been for several decades now. We, as a staff at DATCP, have been gearing up and learning and training amongst ourselves and with some of our county partners. We hope to improve on that capacity, and that's certainly part of our strategic approach moving forward.
Thanks so much, Bart. And then there was a second part of that, is there funding for it if it has to be done by a private engineer? Thanks, Tracy. Get me back on screen. And there is at least one new program in flooding in a flood resilience context through the Division of Emergency Management, the new pre-disaster flood resilience grant program that does include some funding for design and engineering for projects if they have a flood resilience focus. Or a restoring hydrology to reduce flood risks and damages focus. So that's something new that our organization worked on and has been able to get in place. And we are well aware of the needs for more financial support for those kinds of efforts, and we'll continue working on it as policy staff. The other thing I'll mention is that at our conference in February, one of the things we have planned is a working group on floodplain restoration permitting, because we know there's just an awful lot of challenge in the policies at the federal and sometimes yet even still state level. And so we want to have an ongoing conversation about how we can make that more workable for everyone, more affordable, and more certainty. But there's a lot to work through, as of course you all know. There is a couple comments in the chat and one more question. Maybe we can go and then we'll wrap. In more ag predominant settings where reed canary grass has taken over native wetland vegetation, does this species still provide any benefit in our efforts to let nature take its course? Or should there be a more concerted effort to try to get native vegetation back? And Tracy's grabbing the computer from me. I was going to hand it to him anyway.
So yeah, let me answer that real quickly. As we all know, it's very complicated, and we've done so many alterations to our watersheds and the conditions, and it's brought in a lot of weeds. What I like to tell people is we know this much about what's going on out in nature, and the more we can bring back conditions, and it starts with the hydrology, to a historic type scenario in a modern context, the easier it is to deal with the other problems. And invasive species is a really good example of that. We can spray weeds, we can do a lot of weed control type work, but if we're not bringing back the conditions that promote the native plant communities, we're pushing the rock up the hill like Sisyphus, right? We've got to give the conditions that will give the edge to the native plants and the native communities, or the weeds will persist no matter how much we go after them. Now, the other part of that question was, is there any value to reed canary grass? And that's all about your perspective, right? In some areas where it literally is way too expensive to get rid of the reed canary grass that's already taken over everything, sometimes you gotta live with, plan B and accept what's there, what you can intervene, or maybe it's just too expensive or too impossible to change those conditions. So that's the real art and challenge on doing this type of restoration is understanding historic conditions, but then adjusting your interventions or non-interventions to a modern context. And that there's no easy answers for that. And that's why the 3 questions approach is so important. Understand historic conditions, how they were formed, what have we changed, and then what can we do or not do to bring back some semblance of health based on historic conditions in the modern context. And the modern context is the most important part of that 3rd question.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tracy. And I'll just wrap by saying that in the whiteboard exercise in the box on what do you need to know more about, there were actually quite a few comments that were in that same vein of how much do I intervene, when do I intervene, when do I let it go, related to vegetation and woody debris and natural channel forms, et cetera. So clearly a topic that folks are interested in more conversation on. I think with that, we should wrap to be respectful of everybody's time, but I want to thank all of you so much for joining us, for sticking with us, for a great conversation, for all your input. And of course, thanks again to our funder, EPA, our collaborators at DATCP, including especially Matt and Bart, and Wisconsin Land & Water for helping promote and post these videos. So we'll be back soon, and we hope to see you all in January. And in the meantime, happy holidays and New Year to everybody. Take care.